Hi listeners and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I am Chris Holliday.
Chris, today we are covering anything...
No.
Chris, today we are covering everywhere...
No.
What the hell is this film called? What is it called?
Everything.
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
All at once.
Yeah.
I'm going to start again.
Okay.
That never happened.
We've never done this before.
Nope, that was as bad as it's got.
You've lost it.
I'm flapping in front of David.
Right. Let's go.
Hi again listeners, welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
And today, Chris, we are covering everything, everywhere, all at once, which I think...
Yeah, is this the first time we've recorded this intro, Alex? Or is this the... So yes, everything, everywhere, all at once.
A critique I suspect many listeners would throw at us to try to do every episode,
Sure.
but today we're at least explicitly trying to do it.
Yes.
Very recent...
A tongue twister to say, a maelstrom to watch, I think. There's
Sure.
lots... there's lots... I hadn't seen it. I was saying to our special guest before we started that I hadn't seen it at the cinema. It sort of bypassed me a little bit. So I watched it relatively recently for the first time. Not entirely sure what I make of it, and that seems to be a sort of perhaps a shared consensus that, it's kind of quite visually chaotic. My first note involves the words a cyclone of scenes.
Lovely.
But I think I'm really interested in I went through a Jackie Chan phase as a teen of kung fu films, and so I'm a big fan of Michelle Yeoh, and of course we have a shared affection for Tomorrow Never Dies, in which she plays Waylon, so I've got an early Bond reference in. But in terms of there's a line in it, do not overload the machines, which I think is a sign that sits next to one of the washing machines, but symbolises the whole kind of film.
Yeah.
Overload, kind of chaos, this kind of baroque treatment of style and mise-en-scène and stuff like this. Obviously, lots of visual effects, but also an interesting element to the visual effects in terms of who made, because it turns out there were only 9 people that did this visual effects.
Sure.
Artists who weren't trained. So I think there's loads to say, and I'm really excited about how this conversation will go, because I don't quite know what I make of the film. What about you?
Yeah, from my perspective, I mean, the fantasy of metaverses and multiverses seems to be so prevalent at the moment that it's hard to ignore tackling. How we'll do justice for it with this one,
Yep.
I don't know, but it was an interesting take on that, and obviously was trying to say things with that is slightly different to some of these franchises, but it also hits on stuff that when we actually talked about things like Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, of stuff like the role of consequence in a world where all consequences, or worlds where all consequences are played out, and that links to how does fantasy have consequence when it's escapist and magical and all these kind of fun things. So plenty to talk about. We're also joined today by Dr David Sorfa, who is a senior lecturer in film studies at the University of Edinburgh and editor-in-chief of the journal Film Philosophy, which listeners might give a little clue into his research interests, which are expansive. So David's written on film philosophy and theory, European classical Hollywood and Czech cinema, art house cinema, post-structuralism, phenomenology, and is currently involved in a project on existentialism in cinema, which I believe might play into this conversation in some way.
I think it probably will.
So, David, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's great to be here.
Oh, that's very kind. Yeah, well, okay. Let's try and cover this movie that I can't say, it would seem, so that's going to be a problem, isn't it?
Yes.
But there's lots to potentially go where we could go first with this. Maybe we'll let our guest decide. So how are you coming at this film? You're involved in this project on existentialism in cinema, I'm assuming. So sort of what are your first impressions of it, and what do you feel like unpacking with us today with the movie?
Well, there's a number of things that I think the film engages with in lots of interesting ways. And I think part of this bigger project that I'm working on film and existentialism is taking seriously those kinds of questions that we often have about freedom, about what it means to be human, about that. And there's something about this film, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I think I've got right.
Yep.
Yes, you have. That's a third of our guests have got it correctly. Well, no, 2/3 have got it correct.
It's great. We're 100 or so episodes in, and we're now defining expertise by being able to say the title of the movie.
Yes, everything, everyone at once. Yes.
Oh, great. I'm glad you're here.
And I think, so this film, as you said, that kind of multiple worlds, multiverse ideas have been around for a long time. And you said the word chaos, and I'm quite interested in that. If you remember, maybe you're too young now, but in the early 90s, chaos theory was the big thing. And so I'd be quite interested in exploring that a little bit here, especially through the work of a philosopher called David Lewis, who's written on possible worlds theory. He wrote a book in the early 70s, I think, called Counterfactuals. And I'd be interested in just kind of unpacking some of that possible worlds, chaos theory stuff, and to see how this film presents that to us, whether there's something that the film offers that is more than what the philosophy offers. Because I think this is where we come in film philosophy with the hyphen, is that it's not just us taking a philosopher, David Hume, Nietzsche, Gilles Deleuze, whoever, and applying their thought to a film and saying, oh, look, here is Deleuze's crystal image of time, which we could say about Everything Everywhere All at Once, but rather then asking the question, well, what does this film add to our understanding of that concept? How does it push the philosophy? How does it, in the words of our friend Robert Sinnerbrink, how does it do philosophy? Now, whether philosophy does philosophy is another question, which I don't think we'll be able to answer here. But, that's the thing that I'd like to talk about. But, there's lots more as well.
Yeah, let's do it. Where should we start? Well, I guess we should start with possible worlds.
Yeah, because I think it's I suppose it's foundational to the narrative because the narrative is about the.
You set the plot for us, Chris. This is normally my job.
No. So it's essentially about the the tribulations of a Chinese American immigrant, Evelyn Wang, who's played by Michelle Yeoh, who works with her husband and her daughter at a laundrette. Her daughter is engaged in a same-sex relationship, which is actually super important for the way that some of the film unfolds, and it. I suppose for a film that is visually quite kind of chaotic, and I'm very interested in talking about chaos in relation to digital effects actually as well, and the knock-on effect of minor effects in relation to bigger effects. But there is something almost quite simple about the premise of the film, in that the film is battling the relationship between her and her husband, and her relationship with her child, her profession, the fact that her laundrette, or her and her husband's laundrette, is being investigated for tax. So it's really the two poles of the narrative are tax and laundry, which is part of one of the famous quotes of the film, that love to just spend some time doing taxes and laundry with you. But against that narrative, that relatively simple narrative, is this kind of multiverse arrangement where character relationships, very complex character relationships, are played out across a series of very different and very disparate I was going to say fictional worlds, but we might actually look at the distinction between fictional and possible worlds. A series of possible worlds where events that happen in one world are paralleled, are distorted, are made ulterior to. So it's kind of about the choices that Evelyn makes as a wife and a mother, but those choices not just set within the confines of one fictional diegesis, let's say, but in a diegesis that itself branches out into all these different possibilities based on her, as you were saying earlier, David, kind of logics of freedom and choice. So I think there's lots of things we can say about what is essentially a very simple narrative, that she is battling, or she's wading through a kind of battleground with herself, with her family, with her daughter in particular, and trying to resolve those fractures against the backdrop of a sort of bigger fracture in space and time, if you like.
Yeah, we were talking before recording, David, Chris and I, about the film, and the lazy, easy review of this, which I suspect lots of people did write because I was flicking through it yesterday, is that but for all its multiverses, it's actually a film about very small things and family, and it kind of does court that reading in its kind of its desire to seesaw between the big, the existential, the sci-fi, the the expansive canvas and the kind of domestic drama that it's interested in exploring. So talk to us about that and possible worlds then.
Okay, so I'll just pick up where you left off. Because, thinking about this film again, what became clear, and it's because I just am reading too much kind of existentialist philosophy, that what this film is really about, the shortcut,
such a thing be done.
What this film is really about is suicide.
Okay.
Basically, Joy Wang, Stephanie Su's, the daughter character, what is her kind of fantasy name? Jobu Tupaki.
Yeah.
She is basically wanting to die. She is this force that wants to kill herself. And if you kind of take away a lot of the fantasy elements, it's basically a family that is worried about their quite depressed daughter, who, even though she's in what seems like a loving relationship and all the rest of that, just seems really sad. And, the spinning bagel with everything all on it is this kind of this black hole, which is sort of reminded me of the idea of the black sun, which is an image that comes from one of Julia Kristeva's books on depression, and this idea that there's a black hole at the center of an existence that just sucks everything into it. And that's exactly how that bagel functions in there. And the problem, if there is one in the film, is that Joy's despair is dragging everything else with it. So there's this kind of, I'm simplifying a little bit, but I think this is a desperate attempt to save this daughter from her own depression and from her willed death. So I was thinking about, well, what's the problem in this film? What's everybody worried about here? And they're actually worried about Joy. And of course, that's her name. That's the super ironic name that she is the joyless. And the love story with Evelyn and her husband Waymond Wang, those are kind of on the periphery of this problem. But it's also because I'm actually writing a chapter on suicide at the moment. Right. So obviously, as academics, as soon as you start thinking about something, then everything becomes the thing that
relevant
all at once.
All at once becomes relevant to that. But anyway, so that was so. But to come to, I'm not sure I'm going to segue into this, but into this possible worlds theory. Now, the easiest way I think we can think about this is there's a Ray Bradbury story, which probably everybody knows, from 1952, called The Sound of Thunder, which is time travel is available. I think the book is set in 2050, but I could be wrong about that. And time travel is a commercial enterprise, and you can pay money, get sent back in time to dinosaur age, and if you have enough money, you can pay to shoot a dinosaur, and they'll find a dinosaur that's about to die, and they'll drop you in just before it dies, with a tree falling on it or whatever. You get to shoot it. It would have died anyway.
Right.
And famously in that story, this rich man who goes back sort of loses his nerve and steps off the special hermetically sealed path through the prehistoric jungle, and when they return to the future or to their present, he realizes that everything has changed slightly. That when they left, the left Liberal Party had just won. When he gets back, they had just lost. Spelling of words is a little bit, and then he looks on his shoe and he sees a butterfly that he stood on when he stood off the path, and killing that butterfly has had this butterfly effect. There's some debate whether that term comes from this story or not, but it's certainly part of that tradition. So this idea that changing something in the past, however infinitesimal, will change the outcomes. So what David Lewis in this book Counterfactuals from the 70s says is quite straightforward. He says, and if you don't mind me quoting from him, it is uncontroversially true that things might be otherwise than they are. I believe, and so do you, that things could have been different in countless ways. I therefore believe in the existence of entities that might be called, quotes, ways things could have been. I prefer to call them possible worlds. So whether I decide to say the word but next or and next, that's something, we've got two branches. And I could easily have chosen either one of those words and we could have done, and there'd be a slightly different thing. So for Lewis, these possible worlds, it's part of a discussion in philosophy, if I understand this correctly, and the kind of philosophy he's doing is what it means for something to have actuality, to exist. Yeah. And he goes, but there are things that exist that never happened or that could have existed very easily. And he's not talking about, I think this is where in the film, the problem with, which I'm not sure I like, is the hot dog fingers world.
Yeah.
The idea that this is, the world as far down the branch as possible, that if we go back to the dinosaur ages and we do something pretty big, then there's a whole other kind of thing. I don't see how the hot dog world could have ever come into being, but the idea that those are possible worlds, that they could, if we go back far enough and if we just find a point at which things branch off, then we would find this. Now, the film kind of takes that theory as its centre very quickly, explains it, I think, at least on the second time watching it, relatively coherently. And then you just go, okay, well, if she can find a possible world which is adjacent, now we could try and work out how this actually works in terms of mapping and so on, but she will be able to find a world in which she chose to become a martial arts expert, or something like that, and then tap into that person who would be existing at exactly the same time as her. Because I was thinking about how time works in this film, and it does seem you can't move into the past or the future, but you can only move across time.
Yeah.
And it's only joy, the depressive black hole, that only has or inhabits all her entities at all times at the same time. Yeah, I think that's how it works.
And that's how the film sets her up as somebody who has kind of access to all of these. There's kind of a simultaneity. I mean, so we've talked previously on the podcast about kind of fictional worlds, and so I'm really interested in this distinction between fictional worlds and possible worlds, and I think I'm right in having said that I've cited the work of Ruth Ronin, who works on literary theory and possible worlds, and she says, kind of tying in, and as I was watching the film, I thought this fits with exactly her definition of that distinction between fictional worlds is a bigger branch of which there is a subset of possible worlds. So she argues, and this is a quote, possible worlds are based on a logic of ramification, determining the range of possibilities that emerge from an actual state of affairs. So whereas parallelism is a word that she uses to describe fictional worlds. So we could say the Mission Impossible films are fictional worlds because they're rooted more in a logic of the parallel, because they are our world with our technological. This is Perkins's article on fictional worlds, but it's like the logic of parallelism. It runs parallel to ours. Our history, their film's Hitler is our real world's Hitler.
But Tom Cruise is presumably not alive.
So he's the only James Bond is a fictional character, or Ethan Hunt is a fictional character within a fictional world. We're not invited to read the Mission Impossible films or the Bond films as possible worlds, because they are supposed to run parallel. So she argues that parallelism is her term for a kind of modal structure of a fictional world built on a clear and unmistakable equivalence to our world that's typically validated through its connection to reality. Whereas ramification is marked by different laws that are rooted in like contradiction and divergence. This film seems absolutely rooted in that logic of ramification, a kind of a series of conditional tenses that plays out visually as the fictional world that we think is one fictional world that we see in films and video games and art all the time actually becomes not a fictional world at all. It is actually a world of ramification. And what I like about this film is that it starts off like a Mission Impossible film, like, oh, this is just parallel to our world. But because it suddenly now exists between a network of other ones, that means that it's not a fictional world. That's also one of the possibilities.
Yeah.
So now it's not a fictional world. So there are no fictional worlds in this film, or if there are, they're all fictional worlds, but they're also all possible worlds. Yeah. So that distinction between parallelism and ramification is sort of quite useful in making a distinction between historical fiction and science fiction. One is more conditional tense, and one is more parallel to our world. Yeah. And the difference is often one of degree rather than kind. It's whether or not a film wants to tell us more. So I think this is why I'm interested in the film in relation to these kinds of categories, perhaps.
So if I may, to bring that to sort of how this film is using this kind of strategy we're articulating and unpacking here, I found myself very much identifying with joy in this movie, which is troubling because
based on the intro that we've just done.
But in the sense that, and I think I probably articulate when we've talked about, particularly with the MCU, when we're watching a few of them at the moment, to talk about the slightly more populist version of this kind of world building. The thing that always strikes me is as soon as you engage in a fiction like this, where there are these possible worlds, two things happen simultaneously. I think this film is very interested in exploring, but I'm not convinced. This has been a critique I've levied at the others, which is one, as soon as you start talking about different choices having consequences and enacting them all out, oddly you make your fiction consequenceless, because if everything can happen all at once, the significance of what is happening, I find in some of these other movies.
You mean like dramatic stakes?
Yeah. So like, in an MC world where multiple versions of all the characters can exist, one character dying loses all significance in terms of its impact upon the fictional world. So, which I think this film is interested in exploring, because I think that's Joy's point, isn't it? Once you've seen all the possibilities of the world, none of them actually make any sense. And that's kind of part of her kind of nihilism or fatalism or indeed suicidal tendencies, is that once you've seen how everything plays out all the time, you understand that nothing matters. And then the second one I had was also what can happen in these movies is that by dramatising supposedly all the possibilities, what you end up doing is actually exposing the limitations in one's own imagination, because it's actually like some of these movies, like, isn't it interesting that you've never thought of a world where none of these characters exist, for example? All the possibilities are actually possibilities of how they can wear different clothes and be in slightly different
and have slightly different
hairstyles.
Ability.
Exactly. Rather than like actually what it's
be different actors.
And again, I think this film is interested in exploring kind of that as well. What's the limitations of how we can represent these worlds through animation, through things like the non-human world with the stones and the kind of So I think the film is interested in exploring both of those things, and I think it taps into some of the ideas or some of the kind of existentialist themes that we might explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think. The rock thing, perhaps second time I watched it, I was a little more sympathetic to the rocks. I think when I first saw it, I thought, oh my God, this is just stupid.
Yeah.
But then I realised that, in fact, the Joy rock kills herself. She throws herself off the thing. So I thought, okay, this fits into my suicide theory.
Sure.
But I'm not sure how. But this, and also coming back to what you were saying, Chris, about this difference between the counterfactual worlds and possible worlds and fictional worlds. I suppose I take it slightly differently, that fictional worlds can be impossible worlds. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, the famous example of an impossible object in philosophy is the round square. Now, by definition, in the way that we use language and understand the world, we cannot have a round square. It's a bit like having a married bachelor or whatever it is. But I could have a story just full of round squares. I probably couldn't have a film of round squares, but I could have a written... And that strikes me as an interesting distinction between written fiction and visual fiction. Mm-hmm. So to bring it back to everything, everywhere, all at once, and because the other question I was thinking, why does it do all this? Why does it have this whole possible worlds thing, and all the flashbang chaos of it all? What's the point here? And I suppose my sense was the important thing is possibility, and that it's almost. It's the literal kind of thing that things could be different. Now, this is going to be slightly weak psychology, but is that I imagine one of the things that might cause, let's call it true nihilism. Nothing is worth doing anymore, and I want to die, or I must die, or there is no... I presume one way of saying a similar kind of thing is saying, I do not see any more possibility. I do not see anything changing. That the black hole image, just that's it. There is nothing else possible. And therefore, I should die, or I must die. But if we're in this kind of multiverse world, then the multiverse is in fact a metaphor for choice. That you could choose to say and or but. You could choose to live or die. And even having that minimal choice, because presumably, and in the depressed world, there is no choice. You are being drawn to death. And I think Lars von Trier's Melancholia is a beautiful example of that, where halfway through when they realize everybody's going to die, there's going to be the big planet crash, Kirsten Dunst's character, Justine, sort of gets slightly happy. I mean, she's not delirious, but she's been depressed and suicidal for the first half of the film. But as soon as she realizes everybody else is going to die, and she was right, she becomes the kind of moral center of that film. Don't know how that fits in what I'm talking about. But the point is that for Joy, what that whole multiple worlds armature is, there is a possible other outcome. And that seems to me the kind of psychological force of that film, that just realizing that something could be different is the minimal thing to stop you from throwing your rock self off the cliff.
And then the highest is that something else could be possible, and that something is a way out.
Yeah. And
that's the thing, I suppose, with this film, the repeating joys that recur across all these different worlds seem to be in this similar state.
Yeah,
there isn't variance in the way that Evelyn has variance. Singer, performer, all these different possible versions of herself, and that coexist in this same time. They are all deliberately variants. And of course, this is also where science fiction loves to have variation. That's part. Whereas the interesting thing about this is that the multiverse for Joy doesn't really offer those kinds of alternatives. It's not
because she's the same in every
she's the
universe.
Same. Yeah.
And that's because that also. I mean, I was just looking at your book, Alex, and thinking about Tsvetan Todorov and his definition, which I've always liked, of the fantastic as the point of ambiguity, where we don't know whether we're in a marvelous, magical world or whether we're in an uncanny, not Freudian, uncanny world where it's a trick, where we think somebody's, so on. So that ambiguity also, I'm trying to work out exactly what is useful about that idea. It comes back to this idea of choice. And of course, with my interest in existentialism, radical free choice is crucial for Jean-Paul Sartre. That you are always, the famous phrase that he uses, you're condemned to be free, i.e. you're condemned to make a choice. Now, I need to think through more how that kind of would work with my slightly utopian, happy reading of Everything Everywhere All at Once, is that once Joy realizes that things don't have to be the same, that change is possible, which perhaps is a little bit American dreamy, you know, if you think, you know, but that you're no longer trapped in this thing. But just that ambiguity, and I think Todorov's idea of the fantastic, where we're not sure what's going on, has this, I think what somebody like Jacques Derrida would call play, like in the pinball machine. There's just, you're not breaking the rules, but you can shift it just enough to have something else happen. And that's very different, I think, to somebody like Alain Badiou and the idea of the event as this cataclysmic sea change, paradigm change. I mean, I think Badiou is very kind of Kuhnian, Thomas Kuhnian in this.
Well, I guess to try and bring some of that together, I think I remember when I first read Sartre, I found it tremendously uplifting as a sort of, you know, 21-year-old pretentious so-and-so, and now I'm a whatever I am, pretentious so-and-so. But like, you know, because I remember, you know, I think the tonic it provides, joy, if such a thing would be, that her depression also becomes a choice, you know, and that realization becomes the tool to the freedom to choose something else, right? Is that actually part of the depressive thinking is that she feels locked, but actually what Sartre would say is that in itself becomes part of the thing is that you're already choosing, you just might not necessarily know you are, and the freedom comes from or part of the freedom comes from accepting no matter what you do, you are choosing. So own the choice a little bit more, but in a less self-helpy kind of way of
but I can see that being a problem, because, you know, one of the things that perhaps defines, at least, I'm not talking about real psychological depression, but let's call it fictional depression, for want of a better term, is that for the depressive, and that's where I like Kristeva's Black Sun, there is no choice. This is the only thing that can possibly happen. And so for Sartre, there's a problem, because what if there is a state, let's call it depression, where you cannot choose? And that's a kind of a psychological problem, because if you can say, oh, you're free, it's like, well, is somebody who's depressed free in the same way? And I think perhaps this is what this film is kind of gnawing away at, sort of in the background, but it seems to me what is structuring the whole thing there.
Yeah, and to bounce the ball back as well with the Todorov thing is that I actually recently...
off you go. Go on, Todorov, off you go.
You guys sit back, I've got this. No. Is that also, and I've actually, this is a reading of Todorov I've come to again recently, because I was recently doing another lecture on it, in that the way Todorov phrases the fantastic is it's a choice. It's between two choices. But actually, it strikes me that there's also a third choice which he never articulates, which is not to choose. Which is not to choose between those two fixed determinacies, and to choose the ambiguity as
kind of prolong the hesitation,
and to act,
because he always sees the hesitation as brief.
Yes. And as a failure to choose or an inability to choose, but actually you could choose not to. You could choose not to choose. So I would throw that. That you can throw that in the mix. In that actually, it's part of what the film's trying to work through is to follow your reading. It's almost, to be glib about it, she's trying to imagine a possible world where she might be happy.
Exactly.
Right? A vision of herself that might be happy.
Yeah.
And part of that happiness comes from not seeing this kind of direct connection between decisions and meaning and agency and all this kind of stuff, and actually kind of to live in the fantastic a little bit more, to live in the ambiguity.
So she's trying to prolong the hesitation by,
or find some, I guess. You know, once you're stuck in the kind of black sun of depression, even to find space between that is part of the liberation.
Isn't it interesting though that joy is, well, you may disagree, is that joy is not the centre of the film.
Yeah.
That Michelle Yeoh, who is not depressed in the same way, or perhaps even not depressed at all, but is kind of there's lots of references, but kind of I wrote down kind of femininity reaching. There's a whole question about femininity reaching its full potential. Of course, the divorce narrative is a really interesting kind of backdrop to some of these things. I also wrote down women at their breaking point, and was thinking. Again, I was thinking about how this might fit into a contemporary moment, of course, when and I don't think the film is doing this, but of course, categories of the woman are under attack quite consistently. And so I just thought it was interesting that we sort of are positioning Joy as this. We've talked a lot about Joy, but actually she's not the main character and doesn't appear in the film for quite some and yet she's the character who has a resolution that. So I don't know. I just wonder what people thought about that it's very much Michelle Yeoh's movie. Well, at least that's why I thought.
But I think perhaps that's where we could say, in fact, the film has a slightly unsatisfying ending for her, which is she really does love her husband.
Yeah.
And she's actually trapped. And in some ways, you kind of... What is lost is Waymond. I'm not mispronouncing it. It's spelled with a W. Waymond's choice to divorce her. That's kind of taken away from him as well. So I didn't like that end. No. You know, it seemed too glib and actually, because in fact now I'm trying to remember what happens to Alpha Waymond, kind of from the other world.
Because doesn't he get killed in the sort of mall shootout thing? Does he not get killed in that? And he says, he says some final words to him and then kind of collapses. Right. Oh no, and then he comes back again, doesn't he? I got really confused because there's another version who's like in a car or like the back seat or like a control room or something with a headset on.
Yeah, that's Alpha Waymond.
But okay, so he then the one who's in with her channels that guy and dips in and out. Yeah, I can't remember what happens to him then. No. I remember
he gets killed by Joy in the Alpha world.
Right, okay.
When she attacks the kind of that...
Yes, they have a crack...
thing.
The Matrix ship.
Exactly.
The bit in Inception where the white van goes off the edge of the...
Okay.
There were lots and lots of bits, and I think that's where the chaos, chaos is kind of productive, and certainly within visual effects, the way that these films are kind of chaotically produced is that you have different spaces and times. You have stuff in camera, post-production, you have kind of sequences that are caught or trapped in these different... between analog and digital spaces, and so films are very chaotic because stuff is hidden cuts are hidden, or so I quite like chaos as this sort of generative way of talking about.
I was going to ask you about chaos because what am I trying to say? There's something to the way this film is edited that is not.
You said before we started
chaotic. I don't think. I mean, it's hectic and it's hyperbolic and it's lively. But I wonder if when we're saying chaos, do we mean pro-filmically chaotic? Do we mean like because the shots are quick? Like, but there's something quite reassuring, almost kind of like, a meta-cinematic reading of like cinema's ability to stitch everything together and create meaning. You can almost use this to teach editing analysis in like an intro to film studies course, right? Where when you're desperately trying to get students to find links between shots and all that sort of stuff, the film is very good at kind of stitching all these worlds together, even though we keep jumping in between all of them. I guess my thing is, when we talk about world building, we're often talking about pro-filmic mise-en-scène, things like that, but the edit becomes so important to a movie like this to kind of... I don't find the editing chaotic. I actually think it's pretty... it's continuity editing.
I mean,
right?
Were one to do an average shot length, fine, yes, they'd be very, very short.
Yes.
But there is a kind of a false equivalence in close analysis of the film where students talk about, and the rapid editing makes it all. And you're like, it doesn't though, actually. But
it's like a mosaic isn't chaotic, is it? You can see the picture. There's just lots of little bits stuck together.
So maybe it's to do going back to this issue of time because all the things are happening simultaneously. There's a lot of match on action. So close-ups of Michelle Yeoh's face are repeated. So there is a kind of linearity. It's not non-linear. The only weird bit of the film for me was the opening shot of the film where you have them kind of laughing as a family in a window or something.
And then in the mirror, and then in fact the camera disappears into the mirror. Yeah.
That's the only bit that's a kind of weird, a strange,
kind of and never sort of comes out.
Yeah.
Because then there's a parallel mirror that we see Waymond's face first as well. So we're in
she's
a mirror
doing the taxes.
world. So I was thinking, I'm not sure how that would work, but there's kind of we're already framed in the mirrored world.
But that's the only part of the film where the timing was confused because I didn't know whether that was before. Well, if it's after, the events that are happening, then the end of the film isn't the end of the film. In the same way we talk about consequentiality, the ending of the film is satisfactory. That's only because the film has ended, but the world does not. Fine, but if that's the only bit where the time is confused, because you don't know what you're seeing in the mirror, whether that's because then it abruptly cuts and they're not a happy family. She's doing the taxes and it's all very kind of grey and claustrophobic and stuff.
But they are at the end.
But so if it's the end at the beginning, then that means that we've already seen the happy ending before we. Anyway, but that's the only bit that's confused. I agree with you. Everything seems to be happening quite in an relatively orderly fashion. There's no the editing is actually an illusion, because actually it seems quite comparative. Like, I didn't feel disjointed with the film. I sort of understood in the same way I don't find Inception particularly confusing. You just one's in the snow, one's in the back of the car.
I use Inception to teach continuity editing, because I think it's an incredibly good example of just how to make things very simple with visual cuts and things like that. It's not very difficult to follow at all.
I suppose to say the obvious, that the fact that Joy is a young girl with a partner who she's trying to, the film is also interested in the generation. So you have the older James Hong character, really old father, then you have the parents, and then you have her and her new partner. And it's also as much about the union of those two generations. And one of the payoffs of the film is the grandfather holding the girlfriend's hand and just repeating the word girlfriend. Like that's one of the emotional payoffs of the film. So it's also about that, but it's as I said, I was sort of I was expecting. I was kind of torn between Michelle Yeoh's character Evelyn as being the centre, and then actually it's more about than I'd understood from the trailer or the brouhaha around the film, that it's kind of more about this teenage girl who's moving through a world not kind of built for her, and which is one of the ways that often queer identities have been understood, that you're trying to move through these spaces, and that's also where visual effects are kind of queering, and that maybe this is where the chaos comes in, because digital effects queer space and time, but they do so on screen, but they do at the level of production where you have these different shots composited together and that are made across in different parts of the world and brought. So there's all these interesting things that I'd not really thought the film was doing, but I knew this would happen. That we'd have a conversation about
but
it.
I think, in terms of the special effects, I suppose this is where the hot dog hands world rankles, because the effect is clearly terrible. I mean, those are rubber hands, and they're very clearly not even high-end rubber hands. And there's a certain joy in the crappiness of that effect, which is also you see in Swiss Army Man. There's a lot of special effects there, but a lot of it is quite crappy. But then, in fact, because one part of the film, which is almost a reference back to Terrence Malick's Badlands, where Sissy Spacek and Martin Sheen, is it Martin Sheen?
Yes.
Build a little fantasy house in the forest when they've run away, as in these Bonnie and Clyde characters. So that's what the Dead Body and Paul Dano do. They build a fantasy bus, and they act out scenarios from Hank's life in that as well. So, but it's all done out of sticks and stones. So there's a certain joy in the kind of practical effects and of the possibility of imagining other worlds with even rudimentary kind of. It doesn't all have to be very realistic, very kind of 8K and all that kind of stuff. Just having some. Well, again, that's why I kind of think, well, if the hot dog's hands worked for me, that would help, but they don't. I find.
Is it right that the hot dog hands version? Is that the version where Deirdre and Evelyn are a couple?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And
I don't know. That seems an interesting way of doing that relationship in a sort of a possible world of a kind of a queer relationship, a lesbian relationship between these two characters. That there's this kind of not an undercutting of it, but it's made absurd or it's made surreal, and it kind of reminds me of our episode on Spider-Verse, where it's like all these different anyone can be Spider, including a pig, and it's that sort of like ridicules everybody can be Spider-Man, a black guy, a pig, like it's just sort of makes it absurd. And I just wonder whether there's lots of absurdity in the film. There's a great obviously great Ratatouille references, of course, but there's something interesting about
Raccoon-tooey.
but I don't quite understand. I was very touched by their relationship, the same-sex relationship in this multiverse or this possible world, that seemed to be made absurd by these silly hands, silly fingers, and I don't know what was. I thought, that's a shame. That's a shame the film's doing that in relation to this.
Well, if the film was saying, this is so crazy for these two women to be in an affair, as crazy as them having hot dog hands. It's possible.
I don't know. It's just an interesting. That's the world that stood out to me most for all kinds of reasons.
This is definitely a massive over-reading / well, I don't really believe in over-reading, but a bonkers reading. But it's just the line is resonating with me while we're having this conversation, so I'll mention it now. Is that there was a line about the distinction between you can't and you won't. I can't remember who says it to who in the movie, but I wrote it down in my notes. You say you can't, but you mean you won't, is what they say. Yeah. And it's that kind of, it could be done, you just won't do it. And I wonder if the film's interested in that in many ways, but the way I was thinking about it with this is that there's a certain, just on a kind of basic kind of mechanics filmmaking approach, that why can't we make this? We won't make this movie because we don't have the budget for it, or we can make this movie even if it looks ridiculous, so we will make the movie. Kind of, there's a certain quiet politics of lo-fi going on in some of these moments. Whether it works all the time, I don't know, but it's definitely courting a kind of, and the film's reception kind of evidence is this kind of we are making a film with a deliberately insanely ambitious title, with a budget that can't support it, on a scale that you don't normally see this level of filmmaking do, and we're doing it in a slightly ramshackle manner, and that's something to be because we can, we will. We won't let you tell us we won't.
And we're also going to reference all our favourite movies. And we're going to get stars from the Goonies and rehabilitate them, and just do this. And I think, because now that we're swapping quotes, the quote for me from the film, which happens a number of times.
And ready to go.
You're going to be going next. Is we can do whatever we want. Nothing matters.
Yeah.
Now, if that isn't pure existentialism,
sure.
Everything is possible, and it's because there is nothingness at the centre of being, but not the black sun, but something else, a nothingness in that way that so many people have tried to get to grips with, with Jean-Paul Sartre's being and nothingness. What does it mean to have nothing at the centre? And the way I always try and explain that is to say, well, nothingness is possibility. Because if there isn't nothingness, you're trapped. I mean, so it's the gap that I talked about.
I think that's what I was struggling to articulate earlier with what joy needs. What the depressive position needs is to see the black sun as nothingness rather than see it as emptiness or whatever the equivalent would be. And I think it's been a while since I've read it, but in his Psychology of the Imagination, Sartre talks about the act of imagination positing nothingness, right?
Exactly.
And exactly as you're saying, as a tool through which freedom and freedom can be and choice can be expressed. I think you're absolutely right on that. Go on then, Chris. Got a quote?
My quote is towards the end when I think it's Wayman says, "Let's not live in a fantasy," which suggests that the world that they're in. I suppose that's the other thing with possible worlds, that one always thinks that there's a centre and then possible worlds are defined in relation to. Whereas this film tries to destabilise the project of a centre by saying, well, they're all everything all at once. They're certainly everything. So I wonder whether. He says, let's not live in a fantasy, as if to try and bring things back to the real world. But the film has tried to say that this is not even the real world because it coexists among many different possibilities. So that struck me. And as I said, the quote at the beginning, do not overload the machines, I thought was a nice little throwaway gag in the corner of this big sign on the laundrette, which is sort of exactly... It's an overload here. Anyway.
Can we talk about martial arts and kung fu and bodies and I don't know. I have questions, but I have no answers to this. Which is that with the way we're describing this movie, it sounds the characters could be sat on a sofa having a lovely chat. What they spend most of the movie doing is engaging in kind of kung fu, high kicking action. And I'm interested in what I didn't quite get. Well, I was trying to work through what the film is doing with that. I mean, part of it is the kind of genre fun of, hey, let's do this as an action flick. It's obviously interested in Michelle Yeoh's stardom.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the worlds is essentially what if you were Michelle Yeoh rather than this laundry owner. and then I just wonder, there's also something weird about sort of Asian bodies and kung fu, and there's a weirdness to like the logic of, okay, if you didn't meet this man, obviously what you'd have done is become a kung fu star instead. So I just, lots of things, but there's a lot of kung fu in this movie to help express these ideas. And then if you really start picking at this, is there some sort of weird thing about, I mean, The Matrix also has lots, like there's I don't know, anyone got thoughts on kung fu or the issue of, I don't know, just sort of, there's lots, you know, or Asian identity, how the film engages with the sort of Asian identity of many of its characters more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this, you know, I mean, the term that certainly comes to mind immediately as you say it like that is a kind of an Orientalism, this fantasy of the Asian as magical, as excessive, as hypersexualized, you know, in Said's book, all those kinds of things. Yeah. What's interesting about the Kung Fu film is this fantasy of self-reliance. I'm not sure if that's the right term. You know, the idea that, again, there's this kind of, if you train hard enough, if you put in the work, you will be able to overcome. There's this kind of very kind of rely on yourself in order to overcome your problems. Now, of course, you know, we'd have to look at a whole bunch of different films, and the one actually, if I ever get back on this, if I manage to inveigle my way back, and it'll be to talk about Sword of Doom. But anyway, that's a different sort of film.
Mental note.
But, well, I'm not sure there's let's call it a fantasy film. But the other point I was going to make on that, and one of the interesting things about cinema in Africa, stay with me,
I'm coming,
is that in the 1960s and 1970s, as far as I'm aware, the most popular genre cinema, the most popular African cinema was Kung Fu cinema.
Okay.
That was what was shown, certainly in South Africa, in township cinemas for black people, because of course there was full segregation. They mainly showed Kung Fu films. And there's quite a lot written about people remembering what those films were, why they were so popular. It's Bollywood and Kung Fu films are the popular cinema of Africa in the 70s. So there's something about empowerment there as well. Yeah. You know, in quite a simple sort of way. You don't need anything. No. You know, you've got the power in your pinky to overcome ideology and politics.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I can see the kind of, you know, the way that existentialism fell out of favour because it was seen as a kind of neoliberal, at least this is part of my argument I'm making, a kind of a neoliberal philosophy, because it basically says everything's up to you, you're alone, your choices are your own, the facticity of the world, what Sartre calls later the practico-inert, which I think is a great term that nobody ever uses. But the reality of the world, it's up to you to choose to overcome it. And again, you can see where the problematic is. It's like, oh, you're depressed. Oh, well, just choose not to be depressed. When there's a built-in problem that's exactly what depression is stopping you from doing. And I think that's what Everything Everywhere All at Once is kind of tapping into that kind of empowerment fantasy of the Kung Fu genre, and kind of letting it play along through Michelle Yeoh and through all that, but into this kind of how, you know, creating a space for choice, a space for freedom.
No, my only addition to that is, I suppose, thinking about the late 1990s and the arrival of Jackie Chan as a star. So I think the early 90s he makes the third Police Story with Michelle Yeoh. Then he sort of makes a series. Jackie Chan's first strike around 95, 96. Jackie Chan's Who Am I? Michelle Yeoh is in Tomorrow Never Dies in 97. 98, Jackie Chan makes the first Rush Hour. 99 is when The Matrix comes out. 2000 is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So there's this kind of intensification, certainly. And scholars are writing about the relationship that these films have to visual effects, so kind of wire fu. So, and people like Lisa Funnell writing, who's interested in Bond movies, but also writing about warrior women, and this early 2000s sort of, you know, space of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, but also things like House of Flying Daggers and stuff like that. So I suppose on a visual effects, bodies in motion, bodies suspended, that of course is related to, and of course Hollywood would bring this into early films actually that were interested in femininity. So I've always been interested in how early 2000s Hollywood movies, we talk about Yeoh moving from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon into, by way of The Matrix, into Hollywood. But it moved into Hollywood, not in male-oriented genres. So male-dominated action cinema was born, was Batman Begins, and was, I guess, more gritty. Whereas Yeoh actually went into post-feminist cinema. So Charlie's Angels, Underworld, Aeon Flux, all these kinds of... So it was very closely connected with femininity. Strangely, rather than male bodies doing all the even
Daniel Craig runs through a wall.
That's not the same as
Yeoh.
And I'm really interested in post-feminism's double entanglement as scholars that write about, and how that plays out through bodies that are being suspended both as part of their power but also being kind of constrained by being puppets. Anyway, so I'm interested in kind of the post-feminism related to post-production and all this sort of stuff. So I guess from a visual spectacle point of view, effects are often celebrated for what they can do to the body, and kung fu is a great way of showing bodies doing things slightly differently as well, I would say.
I'm glad I asked that incredibly half-baked question, because those are both absolutely fascinating answers that do crystallise thoughts. But yeah, I've got nothing to add to it.
We've done it. Thank you.
David, before you leave us and return to the world of the possible or the now, you're speaking about the future. You've got this. So this book's on Existentialism cinema. It'll be out in a few years, or a year or two?
Probably a year or two.
Okay, so
I'm just busy kind of working.
Tease us with the wider project, if you can.
The wider project is really kind of taking some of the big ideas of existentialism, and in fact I called up my talk from tomorrow to give things like freedom and responsibility, death, existential isolation, the absurd, in a number of ways, the idea of authenticity, what does it mean to act in bad faith or good faith as well, problems of anxiety and angst, identity and individuality, nothingness in the broader way. And then I think at the centre of this project is actually almost returning to Sartre's lecture from 1945, existentialism is a humanism. Yeah. And just almost going sort of, perhaps part of that is sort of going, actually humanism is not over. There is something of value to think about ourselves as humans and what that might mean. And I think that those are not easy questions to answer, but I think that's what I'm trying to do. And of course, this list of concepts that I've just gone through, freedom and all the rest of that, that's what films are about. And so, I'm going to be looking at westerns and freedom, film noir and freedom, the problem of suicide in film, and so it's kind of these kind of big ideas, and then just going through a whole bunch of quite interesting film examples as well. And it's based on a course I've been teaching for the past 3 or 4 years at the University of Edinburgh on film and existentialism. And I suppose I think that existentialism is coming back into fashion, and I think certainly a lot of my students, it's the first time they've actually ever read any existentialism beyond one sentence from de Beauvoir and nothing from Jean-Paul Sartre. Unless they're French students, in which case they've read half or at least half of one chapter of Being and Nothingness. Okay. So it's just about kind of saying, on the one hand, these are really interesting ideas that talk to issues that are relevant to a lot of films, but also, and this is the secret behind the project, is that existentialism underlies a lot of film theory. That a lot of the film theory we know and like from the ideological critics of the 60s and 70s to Deleuze and other film philosophers, they all came out of the Sartrean existentialist tradition, that post-war thing. And I think that's been forgotten, that existentialism, in fact, is the core of a lot of what we do in film studies. At least that's my big claim.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow.
I'm really excited to read it. It sounds really, really great.
Amazing.
Yeah. You've got one book sold already, and hopefully many more. So,
I'll borrow his one. I'm joking.
Great. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much.
It was really great to unpack the movie with you, and hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. If there are some concepts or ideas that we mentioned there that you feel could do with a bit more unpacking, you can of course suggest. I've run out of words. You can also, of course, send us some suggestions for our future footnote episodes. You can do that at our Gmail account, fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. And Chris and I or someone else will break down the concept in 10 minutes, not do it justice, but perhaps give you a flavour of what it means. You can use that handle as well. That's fananimresearch, FANANIM research, to find us on social media, and you can talk to us there. You can also check out the website, fantasy-animation.org. Look at the archive of podcasts and blogs there.
All at once.
All
at once.
Indeed.
Yeah.
We must return to the murky world of here and now. Thank you to BAFS, British Association of Film, Television and Screen Studies conference, and to the University of Lincoln for hosting us for this episode. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.